The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge when Jacob McCall first heard the shouting. He had been loading supplies into his wagon outside Morrison's general store, preparing for the long ride back to his ranch in the foothills, when the commotion erupted from the direction of the sheriff's office. Men were gathering in clusters, their voices carrying a mixture of excitement and bloodlust that made Jacob's stomach turn. Sheriff Hawkins emerged from his office, his face grim as he addressed the growing crowd. 7 young Apache women stood in chains behind him, their dark eyes defiant despite their circumstances. The sheriff raised his voice above the murmur of the crowd, announcing that the women had been captured after a raid on the Henderson farm that had left 2 men dead and a barn burned to the ground. Jacob pushed through the crowd, his weathered hands clenched into fists as he listened to the sheriff's words. The oldest of the women couldn't have been more than 20, and the youngest looked barely 16. Their traditional clothing was torn and dirty, evidence of their rough capture, but their bearing remained proud. They stood with their backs straight, refusing to cower before the hostile crowd that was already calling for immediate justice. The rancher had dealt with Apache tribes for years, trading fairly and maintaining peaceful relations with the various bands that moved through his territory. Something about this situation felt wrong to him. The Henderson farm was located deep in settler territory, far from traditional Apache hunting grounds, and the idea of 7 young women conducting a deadly raid without male warriors seemed highly unlikely. As the crowd grew more agitated, someone shouted about organizing a hanging committee. Others voiced their agreement, claiming that formal trials took too long and cost too much money. Jacob watched as Sheriff Hawkins seemed to waver under the pressure, his resolve weakening with each angry voice that joined the chorus for immediate retribution. The rancher stepped forward, his tall frame and commanding presence causing the crowd to quiet slightly. He had built a reputation in the territory as a fair man who could be trusted, someone who had successfully mediated disputes between settlers and native tribes on multiple occasions. His voice carried clearly across the square as he questioned the rush to judgment, pointing out that the evidence against the women seemed circumstantial at best. Several men in the crowd turned their anger toward Jacob, accusing him of being an Apache sympathizer who cared more about savages than honest settlers. The rancher stood his ground, noting that he had known Tom Henderson for over a decade and that the man would have wanted proper justice, not mob violence. He challenged the crowd to consider whether they were acting out of justice or fear. Sheriff Hawkins seized upon Jacob's intervention as an opportunity to restore order. He announced that the women would be held in the jail overnight while he investigated the matter further, and that any man who attempted to take the law into his own hands would face serious consequences. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, with many muttering threats and promises to return if justice wasn't served quickly. As the square emptied, Jacob approached the sheriff with growing concern. The 2 men had worked together before to maintain peace in the territory, and Jacob could see the uncertainty in the lawman's eyes. Hawkins confided that he was under tremendous pressure from influential men in the territory to resolve the matter swiftly, and that he wasn't entirely convinced of the women's guilt himself. That evening, Jacob made his way to the jail to speak with the Apache women. The oldest among them, who introduced herself as Ayanna, spoke broken English and served as translator for the others. Through her, Jacob learned that the 7 women had been traveling to join relatives in the southern mountains when they were captured by armed men who claimed they were responsible for the Henderson raid. Ayanna's story painted a different picture entirely. She and her companions had been gathering medicinal plants in a valley several miles from the Henderson farm when riders surrounded them. The men had been rough and aggressive, binding the women and bringing them directly to Copper Ridge without any investigation into their actual whereabouts during the supposed raid. Jacob pressed for more details, and Ayanna revealed something that chilled him to the bone. The men who had captured them were not ordinary settlers or members of a posse. They were well organized and seemed to know exactly where to find the women, as if they had been specifically targeted. More disturbing still was her description of the leader, a man with distinctive scars across his left cheek who had spoken to his companions about making sure the Apache problem was solved permanently. The rancher left the jail that night with his mind racing. He had heard rumors of a group operating in the territory that sought to drive out all Apache tribes through whatever means necessary, but he had dismissed them as frontier gossip. Now faced with Ayana's testimony and the convenient timing of the women's capture, he began to suspect that something far more sinister was at work than a simple case of frontier justice. Jacob spent a restless night at the boarding house, his mind churning over Ayana's words. Before dawn, he saddled his horse and rode out to the Henderson farm, determined to examine the scene of the alleged raid for himself. The morning air was crisp as he approached the burned remains of the barn, noting details that the initial investigation might have missed. The destruction was extensive, but as Jacob walked through the ashes, several things struck him as odd. The fire had burned incredibly hot and fast, consuming the entire structure in what must have been a matter of minutes. More puzzling was the pattern of the burn, which suggested the use of accelerants rather than the typical materials an Apache raiding party would have available. Tom Henderson's widow, Mary, emerged from the farmhouse as Jacob examined the scene. Her eyes were red with grief, but she welcomed the rancher's presence, having known him as one of her husband's closest friends. She recounted the events of that terrible night, describing how she and her husband had been awakened by the sound of horses and shouting men. According to Mary, Tom had grabbed his rifle and gone outside to investigate, ordering her to stay hidden in the house. She had heard gunshots and screaming, followed by the roar of flames as the barn caught fire. By the time she dared to venture outside, her husband and their hired hand were dead, and the raiders had vanished into the darkness. Jacob listened carefully to her account, asking gentle questions about what she had seen and heard. Mary's description of the attackers was vague, as she had only caught glimpses of them in the firelight, but she was certain they had been Indian. When Jacob asked about the hired hand, she mentioned that Sam Cooper had been acting strangely in the days before his death, spending time in town and meeting with men she didn't recognize. The rancher examined the bodies, which had been laid out in the farmhouse awaiting burial. Both men had been shot multiple times, but the wounds appeared to have been inflicted by military-style rifles rather than the older weapons typically carried by Apache warriors. More telling was the absence of traditional Apache war paint or ritual scalping, practices that would have been expected if this had been a genuine tribal raid. As Jacob prepared to leave the farm, Mary mentioned something that made him stop in his tracks. She recalled seeing a man with facial scars watching the farm from a distance several days before the attack. The stranger had been asking questions in town about her husband's activities and his relationships with local Apache bands. The rancher rode back toward Copper Ridge with his suspicions, growing stronger by the hour. He made a detour to visit Chief Running Bear, whose band maintained a seasonal camp in the nearby hills. The Apache leader had known Jacob for years and trusted him enough to speak openly about the tensions building in the territory. Running Bear confirmed that none of his warriors had been involved in any raids against settler farms. More importantly, he revealed that several of his young women had gone missing in recent weeks while gathering food and medicine in traditional areas. The 7 women now sitting in the Copper Ridge jail matched the descriptions of some of those missing tribal members. The Apache chief also shared disturbing information about increased military activity in the region. Soldiers had been questioning tribal members about their movements and activities, but they weren't regular army troops. These men wore civilian clothes and carried themselves like hired guns rather than professional soldiers. Jacob's conversation with Running Bear was interrupted by the arrival of one of the chief's scouts, who brought news that sent a chill down the rancher's spine. The scout reported seeing a large group of armed men gathering at an abandoned mining camp about 10 miles south of Copper Ridge. The men were heavily armed and had been joined by several official-looking individuals who appeared to be giving orders. The rancher realized that time was running short. If his suspicions were correct, the 7 Apache women in jail were pawns in a much larger conspiracy, one that threatened to ignite a full-scale war between settlers and local tribes. He needed proof of what was really happening, but gathering that evidence would require him to take considerable risks. As the sun began to set, Jacob made his way back to town, formulating a plan that would either expose the truth or get him killed in the attempt. He had spent years building relationships and maintaining peace in this territory, and he wasn't about to let unknown forces destroy everything he had worked for. The rancher's first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent a carefully worded message to contacts in the territorial capital. If there was indeed a conspiracy at work, it likely involved corruption at higher levels of government, and he would need allies who could operate outside the local power structure. His next move was to return to the jail for another conversation with Ayanna and her companions. If he was going to risk everything to save their lives, he needed to understand exactly what forces were arrayed against them, and why 7 innocent women had been chosen as the catalyst for what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate the Apache presence in the territory once and for all. Under the cover of darkness, Jacob made his way to the abandoned mining camp that Running Bear's scout had described. He left his horse tethered nearly a mile away and approached on foot, using skills learned during his years as a cavalry scout before he had settled down to ranching. The camp sat in a natural hollow surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided excellent cover for surveillance. From his concealed position among the boulders, Jacob could see at least 20 men gathered around several campfires. Their equipment and organization marked them as professional mercenaries, rather than ordinary settlers or even regular army troops. Most disturbing was the presence of 3 men in expensive suits who were clearly giving orders to the others. The rancher recognized one of the suited men as Douglas Cartwright, a wealthy businessman who had been buying up land throughout the territory for the past year. Cartwright's acquisitions had followed a suspicious pattern, focusing on properties near known Apache hunting grounds and water sources. Now, watching him coordinate with hired guns, Jacob began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy. As Jacob strained to listen to the conversation, he caught fragments that confirmed his worst fears. The plan was to use the execution of the 7 Apache women as justification for a military campaign that would drive all native tribes from the territory. Once the Apache were gone, Cartwright and his associates would claim the valuable mineral rights and water resources that the tribes had been protecting. The scarred man that Ayanna had described was clearly visible in the firelight, and Jacob heard him referred to as Cain. This mercenary leader was outlining plans for additional raids that would be blamed on Apache retaliation for the hangings. The systematic nature of the conspiracy was breathtaking. In its scope and cruelty, Jacob's blood ran cold as he listened to Cain describe how the Henderson raid had been carried out by his own men, disguised as Apache warriors. Tom Henderson had apparently discovered something about Cartwright's land acquisitions and had threatened to expose the operation to territorial authorities. His murder had been planned to look like an Apache raid while simultaneously providing the justification needed for the larger military action. The conversation revealed that Sheriff Hawkins was not part of the conspiracy, but several of his deputies had been bought or intimidated into cooperation. The plan called for the sheriff to be overwhelmed by public pressure and forced to allow vigilante justice to take its course. If he continued to resist, arrangements had been made to remove him from the equation permanently. As Jacob prepared to retreat and report what he had learned, disaster struck. A loose stone shifted under his foot, creating a small avalanche that echoed through the hollow. Instantly, the camp erupted into activity as the mercenaries grabbed their weapons and began searching for the source of the noise. The rancher pressed himself flat against the rocks as armed men spread out to investigate. He could hear Cain barking orders, directing his men to search systematically through the surrounding area. Jacob knew that his position would be discovered within minutes, and that his only chance of escape lay in creating a distraction. Using his knowledge of the terrain, Jacob worked his way toward a section of loose shale that overlooked the camp. He gathered several large rocks and sent them tumbling down the opposite slope, creating enough noise and confusion to draw the searchers away from his actual position. In the chaos that followed, he managed to slip away into the darkness. The rancher made his way back to his horse and rode hard toward Copper Ridge, knowing that his time was running out. The conspiracy was moving faster than he had anticipated, and the evidence he had gathered would be worthless if the 7 Apache women were hanged before he could act on it. As he approached the town, Jacob could see unusual activity around the jail. Torches were burning in the square, and he could hear the sound of angry voices. His worst fears were realized when he saw the crowd that had gathered, larger and more organized than the previous day's spontaneous assembly. The rancher pushed his horse through the crowd, ignoring the hostile looks and muttered threats directed at him. Sheriff Hawkins stood on the jail steps, his face pale and his hand resting on his gun. The lawman was clearly outnumbered and outmatched, facing a mob that had been carefully orchestrated to appear spontaneous. Jacob could see Cain among the crowd leaders, his scarred face twisted with artificial rage as he called for immediate justice. The mercenary was playing his part perfectly, appearing to be just another outraged citizen seeking vengeance for the Henderson murders. Other men whom Jacob now recognized as Cartwright's hired guns were scattered throughout the mob, ready to escalate the situation if the sheriff continued to resist. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Jacob realized that he was facing an impossible choice. He could reveal what he had discovered about the conspiracy, but without concrete proof, his word alone would not be enough to save the Apache women. More likely, his accusations would simply mark him for elimination and remove the only person who knew the truth about what was really happening. As the crowd pressed closer to the jail, Sheriff Hawkins looked desperately toward Jacob, silently pleading for support. The rancher knew that the next few minutes would determine not only the fate of 7 innocent women, but the future of peace in the entire territory. Everything he had worked for hung in the balance, and any mistake could trigger a war that would devastate both settlers and Apache alike. Jacob made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to reason with the mob, he dismounted and walked purposefully toward the jail's side entrance, the one used for deliveries and prisoner transfers. His years of friendship with Sheriff Hawkins had given him knowledge of the building's layout that could prove crucial in the next few minutes. The rancher slipped around the back of the jail while the crowd's attention remained focused on the front steps where Hawkins was making his desperate stand. Jacob used his knife to work loose the boards covering a window that he knew led directly to the cell area. The old building's construction worked in his favor, as the wooden frame had warped over the years, making it relatively easy to pry open. Inside the jail, Jacob found the 7 Apache women huddled together in the single large cell. Ayanna's eyes widened with surprise when she saw him, but she quickly understood his intentions and began quietly preparing her companions for escape. The rancher worked frantically to pick the lock, using skills he had learned during his cavalry days when improvisation often meant the difference between life and death. The sound of the angry crowd was growing louder, and Jacob could hear Sheriff Hawkins trying desperately to maintain order. The lawman's voice was becoming increasingly strained as he argued with the mob leaders, buying precious time for Jacob's rescue attempt. Through the jail's front windows, the rancher could see torchlight dancing wildly as the crowd grew more agitated. As the cell door finally swung open, Jacob quickly explained the escape route to Ayanna. The women would need to move silently through the window and make their way to horses that Jacob had arranged to be waiting in the alley behind the blacksmith shop. His friend Sam Turner, the blacksmith, was one of the few men in town who could be trusted completely. The escape began smoothly, with each woman slipping through the window and disappearing into the shadows. Jacob remained inside, preparing to create a distraction that would give them additional time to reach safety. He could hear footsteps approaching the jail's rear entrance and knew that some of the mob members were beginning to surround the building. Suddenly, the jail's front door burst open and Kane stormed inside with several of his men. The mercenary leader had apparently grown tired of waiting for the sheriff to capitulate and decided to take matters into his own hands. Jacob found himself trapped between the cell area and the main office with no way to escape without being seen. The rancher pressed himself against the wall as Kane and his men discovered the empty cell. The scarred man's rage was terrible to behold as he realized that his carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart. He began barking orders to his companions, directing them to search every building in town and organize pursuit parties to track down the escaped women. Jacob waited until Kane and most of his men had rushed back outside before making his own escape attempt. He slipped through the same window the Apache women had used, but as he emerged into the alley, he found himself face to face with one of Cartwright's hired guns who had been posted as a sentry. The confrontation was brief but violent. The hired gun reached for his pistol, but Jacob was faster, tackling the man and engaging in a desperate struggle for control of the weapon. The rancher's years of hard physical labor gave him an advantage in the wrestling match, and he managed to knock his opponent unconscious before the man could raise an alarm. Jacob made his way through the back streets of Copper Ridge, avoiding the main thoroughfares where search parties were already forming. He could hear shouting and the sound of horses as Kane organized his men for a pursuit that would begin as soon as they determined which direction the women had fled. At the blacksmith shop, Jacob found Sam Turner waiting with fresh horses and supplies. The blacksmith had also prepared a detailed map showing several possible escape routes through terrain that would be difficult for large pursuit parties to navigate. Turner's knowledge of the local geography would prove invaluable in the hours ahead. The Apache women were mounted and ready to ride when Jacob arrived. Ayanna had taken charge of the group with natural authority, and it was clear that despite their ordeal, the women were prepared for the dangerous journey ahead. Their faces showed determination rather than fear, and Jacob felt a surge of respect for their courage. The rancher quickly outlined his plan to get the women safely back to Running Bear's camp, where they would be protected by the chief's warriors. The route would take them through rough country that favored experienced riders over large groups of pursuers, but it would also require them to travel fast and cover significant distance before daybreak. As the rescue party prepared to depart, Jacob could hear the sound of approaching horses. Kane's search parties were spreading throughout the town, and it would only be a matter of minutes before they reached the blacksmith shop. The window for escape was closing rapidly, and any delay could prove fatal for everyone involved. Sam Turner clasped Jacob's hand in farewell, knowing that he would likely face questioning about his role in the escape. The blacksmith's parting words were simple but heartfelt, expressing his belief that some things were more important than personal safety. Jacob mounted his horse and led the 7 Apache women into the darkness, beginning a desperate race against time that would test everyone's endurance to the breaking point. The escape party rode hard through the night, following deer trails and creek beds that would make tracking difficult for their pursuers. Jacob led them through terrain he had explored during his years of trading with various Apache bands, using every natural advantage the landscape offered to conceal their passage. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing closer. Kane had organized his mercenaries into 3 separate groups, each taking a different route in an attempt to cut off the fleeing party. The scarred man's military background was evident in the tactical precision of his search pattern, and Jacob realized that they were dealing with a far more dangerous opponent than typical frontier outlaws. As dawn approached, the rancher made a difficult decision. The 7 Apache women were showing signs of exhaustion, and their horses were beginning to falter under the pace he had set. Continuing at their current speed would likely result in capture within a few hours, but stopping to rest would also allow their pursuers to close the gap. Jacob called a halt in a hidden canyon where a natural spring provided water for both horses and riders. While the women rested and tended to their mounts, the rancher climbed to a high vantage point to assess their situation. What he saw filled him with dread. Kane's pursuit parties had spread out across the landscape in a coordinated pattern that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the terrain. More disturbing was the sight of additional riders approaching from the east, suggesting that Cartwright's organization was larger and better connected than Jacob had suspected. The conspiracy clearly had resources that extended far beyond what a simple land grab operation would require. From his elevated position, Jacob could also see smoke rising from the direction of Running Bear's camp. His heart sank as he realized that the Apache settlement was under attack, probably by yet another group of Cartwright's mercenaries. The conspiracy was moving on multiple fronts simultaneously, eliminating any safe haven the escaped women might have hoped to reach. The rancher returned to the canyon with the grim news that they were effectively trapped. The pursuit parties were closing in from 3 directions, and their intended destination was no longer safe. Ayanna listened to his report with stoic acceptance, then surprised Jacob by revealing information that changed everything. The young Apache woman explained that she and her companions had not been captured randomly. They had been specifically targeted because they possessed knowledge that could expose the full extent of Cartwright's operation. During their travels, they had witnessed meetings between white men and renegade Apache warriors who were being paid to stage false raids on settler farms. According to Ayanna, Cartwright's plan involved more than just land acquisition. The businessman was part of a larger conspiracy that included corrupt territorial officials and unscrupulous military contractors who profited from frontier conflicts. By creating artificial tensions between settlers and Apache tribes, they could justify military expenditures while simultaneously clearing valuable land for development. The 7 women had stumbled upon one of these coordination meetings while gathering medicinal plants in a remote valley. They had hidden and observed as money and weapons changed hands between Cartwright's representatives, and a group of Apache renegades who had been cast out from their tribes for previous violent acts. Jacob realized that the women's testimony could expose the entire conspiracy, but only if they could survive long enough to present their evidence to honest authorities. The challenge was getting them to safety when every potential refuge appeared to be compromised or under attack. As the rancher pondered their limited options, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Kane's men had found their trail and were closing in rapidly. Jacob made a desperate decision to split the group, hoping that some might escape even if others were captured. The plan called for Jacob to create a diversion that would draw the main pursuit force away from the women, allowing them to escape through a narrow passage that led toward the territorial border. It was a long shot, but their only alternative was certain capture and probable death. As Jacob prepared to implement his desperate strategy, Ayanna stopped him with a surprising revelation. She produced a leather pouch that contained documents taken from the renegade Apache camp during their escape. The papers included correspondence between Cartwright and his co-conspirators, detailing payments made and operations planned. The documents were written in English, which Ayanna could read despite her limited spoken vocabulary. She had understood their importance and hidden them during her capture, hoping for an opportunity to reveal the truth. The evidence was detailed enough to expose the entire conspiracy, but only if it could reach honest authorities. Jacob examined the documents quickly, his anger growing as he read the callous descriptions of planned raids and calculated violence, designed to inflame tensions between settlers and Apache tribes. The conspiracy was even more extensive than he had imagined, involving figures at the highest levels of territorial government. The sound of approaching riders was getting louder, and Jacob knew that their time had run out. He made a final desperate decision that would either save the 7 Apache women or ensure that the truth about Cartwright's conspiracy died with them in the hidden canyon. The next few minutes would determine whether justice would prevail or whether the forces of greed and corruption would succeed in their ruthless plan to dominate the territory through violence and deception. Jacob's final gamble involved using the canyon's natural acoustics to his advantage. He positioned the 7 Apache women at the narrow rear exit while he climbed to an outcropping that overlooked the main entrance. When Kane's mercenaries entered the canyon, the rancher began firing calculated shots that ricocheted off the rock walls, creating the impression of multiple defenders positioned throughout the area. The deception worked better than Jacob had hoped. Kane's men, unable to determine the source of the gunfire, took cover and began a cautious advance that bought precious time for the women to escape. The scarred mercenary leader shouted orders to his men, but the echoing canyon made communication difficult and coordination nearly impossible. While the mercenaries were pinned down by Jacob's diversionary tactics, Ayanna led her companions through the treacherous passage at the canyon's rear. The route was barely wide enough for a single rider, but it provided access to a network of hidden valleys that the Apache had used for generations to move unseen through the territory. Jacob maintained his position until he was certain the women had escaped, then began his own retreat through a different route he had scouted earlier. His knowledge of the terrain allowed him to stay ahead of Kane's pursuit, but he knew that his advantage was temporary. The mercenaries would soon regroup and continue their hunt with renewed determination. The rancher's destination was the territorial capital, where he hoped to find honest officials who could act on the evidence that Ayanna had provided. The documents in the leather pouch represented the only concrete proof of Cartwright's conspiracy, and getting them to the right authorities was now more important than his own survival. Jacob rode hard toward the capital, changing horses at relay stations and pushing himself to the limits of endurance. Behind him, he could occasionally glimpse dust clouds that indicated Kane's continued pursuit. But the mercenary leader was now operating in unfamiliar territory, without the local knowledge that had given him such an advantage near Copper Ridge. At the territorial capital, Jacob went directly to the office of Judge Harrison Wells, a man known throughout the region for his integrity and his refusal to be influenced by political pressure or financial incentives. The judge listened intently as Jacob presented the evidence and explained the full scope of Cartwright's conspiracy. Judge Wells examined the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read the detailed descriptions of planned violence and corruption. The evidence was substantial enough to justify immediate action, and the judge quickly issued warrants for the arrest of Cartwright and his known associates. The Territorial Marshal organized a large posse that included federal agents who had been investigating reports of corruption in frontier territories. Armed with legal authority and overwhelming numbers, the law enforcement group rode toward Copper Ridge to confront the conspiracy that had terrorized the region. Meanwhile, the 7 Apache women had successfully reached a secret camp where Running Bear and his surviving warriors had taken refuge after the attack on their settlement. The chief was relieved to see the women safe, and he listened with growing anger as Ayanna described the conspiracy that had targeted both settlers and Apache tribes for elimination. The confrontation at Copper Ridge was swift and decisive. Cartwright and his mercenaries found themselves surrounded by federal agents before they could implement their final plans for territorial domination. Kane attempted to fight his way out but was captured after a brief gun battle that left several of his men dead or wounded. Sheriff Hawkins, who had maintained his integrity despite enormous pressure, assisted in the arrests and provided testimony about the intimidation tactics that had been used against him. The honest lawman's cooperation helped expose the full extent of the conspiracy and identified corrupt deputies who had been working with Cartwright's organization. The trial that followed became a sensation throughout the territory, exposing the systematic corruption that had threatened to destroy the fragile peace between settlers and Apache tribes. Ayanna and her companions provided crucial testimony that corroborated the documentary evidence, ensuring that justice was served for all the innocent victims of the conspiracy. Cartwright was sentenced to life in prison for his role in organizing the murders and false raids. Kane and his surviving mercenaries received lengthy sentences for their crimes, effectively ending the threat they had posed to the territory's residents. The exposure of the conspiracy had unexpected positive consequences for relations between settlers and Apache tribes. The revelation that many supposed Apache raids had actually been carried out by white mercenaries in disguise led to a new understanding between the two groups and renewed efforts to maintain peaceful coexistence. Jacob returned to his ranch with a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that his actions had prevented a war and saved numerous innocent lives. The 7 Apache women visited him periodically, maintaining a friendship that had been forged in adversity and sealed by their shared commitment to justice. The territory gradually healed from the wounds inflicted by Cartwright's conspiracy. New settlers arrived seeking honest opportunities rather than schemes for quick wealth, and the Apache tribes were able to maintain their traditional ways of life without fear of unprovoked attacks. Years later, Jacob would reflect on those dangerous days as a time when ordinary people had been forced to make extraordinary choices. The courage shown by the 7 Apache Maidens and the integrity displayed by honest officials like Sheriff Hawkins and Judge Wells had ultimately triumphed over greed and corruption, proving that justice could prevail even in the wild frontier territories where law and order often seemed fragile and uncertain.